Chapter 2. MULTI Theoretical Foundations. 4. CHARISMAPHOBIA as a primary determinant of appearance management and cosmetic use. Fear-based motivation for appearance management and cosmetic use. A foundational distinction must be established before charismaphobia can be properly understood as the primary psychosocial determinant of appearance management and cosmetic use. The dominant assumption in both popular culture and existing clinical literature is that people engage in cosmetic behaviors because they desire attractiveness. That cosmetic use is approach-motivated, pulling the individual toward a positively valued goal of beauty. The present framework based on charismaphobia argues that this desire-based framing is clinically incomplete and theoretically insufficient, and that a fear-based motivational framework more accurately and more powerfully accounts for the persistent, compulsive, and often medically unjustified nature of cosmetic behavior observed in clinical practice. The distinction between approach motivation, behavior driven by the pursuit of a desired positive outcome, and avoidance motivation, behavior driven by the fear of an aversive outcome, is one of the most fundamental in psychological science. Approach and avoidance represent qualitatively different motivational systems with different neurobiological substrates, different behavioral signatures, and different clinical implications. Approach-motivated behavior tends to be flexible, self-regulating, and responsive to the attainment of the desired goal. When the goal is achieved, the behavior reduces. Avoidance-motivated behavior, by contrast, tends to be rigid, compulsive, and resistant to resolution. Because the feared outcome can never be permanently eliminated, the avoidance behavior must be continuously maintained and frequently escalated. This distinction is clinically critical for understanding cosmetic behavior. If cosmetic use were primarily approach-motivated, driven by a desire for beauty, it would reduce once a satisfactory level of attractiveness was achieved. The clinical reality, however, is that cosmetic behavior in charismaphobic individuals does not reduce with achievement but escalates, a behavioral signature that is the hallmark of avoidance motivation rather than approach motivation. Psychodynamic foundations. The psychodynamic school of psychology offers a rich and clinically precise theoretical foundation for understanding charismaphobia as the primary determinant of cosmetic use. Two psychodynamic theorists are particularly relevant: Sigmund Freud, whose classical psychoanalytic framework established the foundational mechanisms of anxiety-driven neurotic behavior, and Karen Horney, whose neo-psychoanalytic revision of Freud's framework introduced the critical role of culture and social pressure in generating neurotic anxiety. Together, Freud and Horney provide a psychodynamic account of charismaphobia that is both mechanistically precise and socioculturally grounded, addressing not only how charismaphobic cosmetic dependency is maintained, but why culturally generated beauty standards constitute such a powerful source of neurotic anxiety in the first place. Freud's foundational observation that anxiety is the engine of neurotic behavior, and neurotic symptoms are maintained not because they achieve desired goals, but because they temporarily reduce anxiety, is directly and powerfully applicable to charismaphobic cosmetic dependency. In Freud's mature anxiety theory, anxiety functions as a signal, a warning to the ego of an approaching threat, that triggers defensive responses aimed at managing or eliminating the aversive experience. When these defensive responses become compulsive, rigid, and self-perpetuating, they constitute neurotic symptoms. Behaviors maintained not by their success in achieving desired outcomes, but by their temporary effectiveness in reducing the anxiety signal. The cosmetic behavior of charismaphobic individuals functions as a neurotic symptom in precisely this Freudian sense. A compulsive behavioral response to the anxiety signal of perceived unattractiveness, maintained by its temporary anxiety-reducing function rather than by any genuine or lasting achievement of the desired state of attractiveness. The charismaphobic individual applies makeup, undergoes cosmetic procedures, and seeks cosmetic surgery not because these interventions permanently resolve their fear of unattractiveness, but because they temporarily silence the anxiety signal. And it is this temporary silencing that maintains and escalates the cosmetic behavior over time. Freud's framework of defense mechanisms offers additional psychodynamic depth to the understanding of charismaphobic cosmetic behavior. Defense mechanisms are unconscious psychological strategies employed by the ego to manage anxiety by distorting, redirecting, or transforming the experience of threat. Two defense mechanisms are particularly relevant to charismaphobia. The first is displacement, the redirection of anxiety from its true source onto a more manageable substitute object. The charismaphobic individual's anxiety is fundamentally about social worth, identity, and the fear of ostracization, profound existential fears about one's value and place in the social world. These anxieties are displaced onto the more tangible and apparently manageable surface of physical appearance, where they can be temporarily addressed through cosmetic interventions. Cosmetic use in this psychodynamic reading is displacement behavior, the management of profound social anxiety through the apparently controllable medium of physical enhancement. The second relevant defense mechanism is reaction formation, the transformation of an anxiety-provoking state into its opposite as a means of managing the anxiety it generates. The charismaphobic individual transforms the feared state of unattractiveness into its opposite, cosmetically enhanced attractiveness, as a reaction formation against the underlying anxiety. The compulsive thoroughness of cosmetic enhancement in charismaphobic individuals, i.e., the excessive, persistent, and medically unjustified nature of their cosmetic behaviors, is consistent with the psychodynamic understanding of reaction formation as a defense that must be continuously maintained because the underlying anxiety it manages is never genuinely resolved. Freud's concept of the ego ideal, the internalized image of the perfect self that the individual perpetually strives to embody, is also directly applicable to charismaphobia. The ego ideal represents the individual's internalized standard of perfection, derived from cultural, parental, and social influences, against which the actual self is perpetually and unfavorably measured. In charismaphobic individuals, the ego ideal is organized primarily around physical attractiveness. The idealized self is beautiful, admired, and socially powerful through the medium of physical appearance. The chronic gap between the charismaphobic individual's actual appearance and their appearance-organized ego ideal generates the persistent anxiety that drives cosmetic behavior. Every cosmetic intervention represents an attempt to close this gap, to bring the actual self closer to the ego ideal. But because the ego ideal is an internalized construct rather than an achievable reality, the gap can never be permanently closed, and the anxiety can never be permanently resolved. This is the psychodynamic mechanism of cosmetic dependency, the compulsive pursuit of an ego ideal that recedes as the individual approaches it. Finally, Freud's concept of the repetition compulsion, the unconscious tendency to repeat behaviors that have previously reduced anxiety, even when those behaviors are ultimately self-defeating, illuminates the escalating and dependency-forming pattern of charismaphobic cosmetic use. The charismaphobic individual repeats cosmetic interventions compulsively, not because each intervention achieves lasting relief, but because the pattern of temporary relief has become compulsively entrenched in their behavioral repertoire. Each repetition of the cosmetic behavior temporarily reduces the charismaphobic anxiety signal, negatively reinforcing the behavior and making its repetition more likely. Over time, this compulsive repetition escalates, requiring more frequent, more intensive, and more invasive cosmetic interventions to achieve the same level of temporary anxiety reduction. This escalating pattern is the clinical signature of charismaphobic cosmetic dependency and is directly consistent with the Freudian repetition compulsion. It is also consistent with the highly significant convergent validity of charismaphobia with OCD. The OCD spectrum being the diagnostic category in which repetition compulsion most clearly manifests in contemporary clinical classification. While Freud provides the foundational mechanisms of anxiety-driven neurotic behavior, his framework locates the sources of neurotic anxiety primarily in instinctual drives and early developmental conflicts, i.e., biological and intrapsychic forces, rather than cultural and social ones. This limitation is clinically significant for charismaphobia, in which anxiety is generated not by biological drives or early developmental trauma alone, but by the pervasive and culturally enforced pressure of beauty standards, a social and cultural phenomenon that Freud's framework cannot fully account for. Karen Horney's neo-psychoanalytic revision of Freud's framework addresses this limitation directly, extending the psychodynamic account of neurotic anxiety from the intrapsychic to the sociocultural, and providing the theoretical tools needed to understand charismaphobia as a culturally generated psychodynamic condition. Horney, 1950, argued that neurosis originates in basic anxiety, a pervasive and deeply rooted feeling of being isolated, helpless, and potentially endangered in a world that is perceived as hostile and indifferent. Basic anxiety does not arise from instinctual frustration, as Freud proposed, but from the experience of growing up in a social environment that fails to provide genuine warmth, security, and authentic recognition. An environment that instead offers conditional acceptance contingent on meeting externally imposed standards of worth. The charismaphobic individual's basic anxiety is generated by precisely this conditional social environment, a cultural context in which social acceptance, recognition, and appreciation are explicitly and pervasively contingent on meeting culturally specific beauty standards. Attractive people, in almost all cultures, are taken positively, and the less attractive ones are ostracized, a social reality that constitutes the external cultural condition from which charismaphobic basic anxiety develops. The individual who internalizes this conditional social acceptance, who learns that their worth is contingent on their attractiveness, develops the basic anxiety that drives charismaphobic cosmetic behavior. In response to basic anxiety, Horney, 1950, observed that neurotic individuals construct an idealized self-image, a grandiose and perfectionistic internal image of the self as it should be, as a compensatory strategy for managing the profound insecurity of basic anxiety. The idealized self-image serves as a psychological refuge from basic anxiety. If the individual can become the idealized self, the threat of social rejection and worthlessness will be permanently eliminated. In charismaphobic individuals, the idealized self-image is organized around physical attractiveness. The idealized self is beautiful, admired, and socially powerful through the medium of physical appearance. The cosmetic behaviors of charismaphobic individuals are psychodynamically understood, in Hornian terms, as compulsive strategies for actualizing this idealized self-image, for closing the gap between the actual self and the cosmetically perfected self that the idealized self-image demands. This Hornian understanding of the charismaphobic idealized self connects directly to the narcissistic trends dimension of charismaphobia. The desire to be the most attractive person and to be regarded as a special person with unique attraction, which represents the behavioral expression of the Hornian idealized self-image in the domain of physical appearance. Horney's concept of the tyranny of the should, the relentless internal demand that one should be a certain way, feel a certain way, appear a certain way, is directly and powerfully applicable to charismaphobia. The should system, in Horney's framework, is the internalized voice of the idealized self-image, the internal tyrant that perpetually measures the actual self against the perfectionistic demands of the idealized self and generates anxiety, shame, and self-contempt whenever the actual self falls short. The charismaphobic individual is tyrannized by a specific and culturally generated should system organized around physical appearance. They should be beautiful, they should look young, they should conform to the culturally specific standards of attractiveness that media and social culture enforce. They should spend whatever time, money, and physical risk is necessary to meet these standards. The mandatory diagnostic criterion of charismaphobia, i.e., taking medically unjustified measures to get or stay attractive, is the behavioral expression of the Hornian tyranny of the should in the domain of cosmetic use. The charismaphobic individual submits to medically unjustified cosmetic procedures because their internal should system demands it, regardless of the medical, financial, or psychological costs. The therapeutic implications of Horny's framework for charismatherapy are direct and specific. Charismatherapy's beauty perception education phase, which educates clients on the culturally constructed and commercially exploited nature of beauty standards, directly addresses the Hornyan basic anxiety by dismantling the conditional social acceptance framework that generates it. The attraction reframing phase, which shifts clients from culturally imposed beauty standards to an age-independent and culturally inclusive concept of attraction, directly challenges and revises the Hornyan idealized self-image organized around physical beauty. The holistic attraction development phase, which cultivates authentic, values-based, and multidimensional attraction, provides the genuine warmth, authentic self-recognition, and unconditional self-acceptance that Horny identified as the antidote to basic anxiety and the foundation of psychological health. Charismatherapy's beauty perception education and attraction reframing phases are thus direct therapeutic responses to the Hornyan tyranny of the should, liberating clients from externally imposed beauty imperatives and replacing them with authentic, self-generated, and culturally independent attraction standards. Behavioral foundations. The behavioral foundations for charismaphobia, or fear-based understanding of cosmetic use, are powerfully illustrated by one of the most influential observations in the history of behavioral psychology. Skinner's analysis of aversive control in human behavior established that much of what appears to be achievement-oriented behavior is in fact avoidance behavior, motivated not by the positive pull of a desired outcome, but by the negative push of a feared consequence. Consistent with this framework, Skinner observed that the student who achieves the highest academic performance is not necessarily the most intellectually gifted, but is frequently the most intensely motivated by the fear of failure. The fear of social disapproval, academic humiliation, parental disappointment, and loss of status that failure would bring. The intellectual capacity to excel is widely distributed among students, but the behavioral intensity needed to consistently outperform peers is generated most reliably not by intellectual capability alone, but by the motivational power of fear. Excellence, in this behavioral framework, is frequently the product of avoidance rather than aspiration. This Skinnerian insight is directly and profoundly applicable to charismaphobia and cosmetic behavior. Just as the highest performing student may not be the most intellectually capable, but the most afraid of failure, the most intensive cosmetic user is not necessarily the person who most desires beauty, but the person who most fears unattractiveness. The cosmetic behaviors of charismaphobic individuals, the compulsive makeup application, the repeated cosmetic procedures, the dependency on anti-aging treatments, the escalation toward cosmetic surgery, are not primarily expressions of a desire for beauty, but expressions of a fear of unattractiveness. They are avoidance behaviors, maintained and escalated not because they successfully achieve a desired goal, but because they temporarily reduce the aversive experience of charismaphobic anxiety. Skinner's behavioral framework further illuminates the role of negative reinforcement in maintaining charismaphobic cosmetic behavior. Negative reinforcement, the strengthening of a behavior through the removal of an aversive stimulus, is one of the most powerful mechanisms of behavioral maintenance. When a charismaphobic individual applies makeup or undergoes a cosmetic procedure, the immediate effect is a temporary reduction in charismaphobic anxiety. The feared state of unattractiveness is, at least momentarily, avoided. This temporary anxiety reduction negatively reinforces the cosmetic behavior, making it more likely to be repeated. Over time, the negatively reinforced cosmetic behavior becomes compulsive and dependency-forming, not because it achieves beauty, but because it temporarily reduces the aversive experience of the fear of unattractiveness. The behavioral pattern is structurally identical to other avoidance-based compulsive behaviors, including the compulsive checking behaviors of OCD, which is consistent with the significant convergent validity of charismaphobia with obsessive-compulsive disorder. Dweck's research on mindset directly extends the Skinnerian observation. Individuals with a fixed mindset, who believe their qualities including physical attractiveness are fixed and immutable, are most vulnerable to fear of failure because any perceived inadequacy threatens their entire self-concept. Charismaphobic individuals exhibit a classically fixed mindset about physical attractiveness, believing that they either are or are not attractive, and that this determines their social value. Charismatherapy's attraction reframing and unique feature identification phases directly cultivate a growth mindset about attraction, helping clients understand that attraction is cultivable, multidimensional, and not dependent on fixed physical features. Bandura's 1977 self-efficacy theory proposes that individuals avoid situations in which they have low confidence in their ability to perform adequately. Low self-efficacy for physical attractiveness. The charismaphobic individual's belief that they cannot meet cultural beauty standards generates avoidance behavior directed at compensating for perceived inadequacy through cosmetic means. Charismatherapy builds self-efficacy for holistic attraction, helping clients develop genuine confidence in their capacity to be attractive through authentic self-expression, values, and interpersonal warmth. Cognitive foundations. The cognitive school of psychology, emerging as the dominant force in clinical psychology through the second half of the 20th century, and establishing itself as the empirical backbone of contemporary evidence-based psychotherapy, offers a theoretically precise and clinically actionable foundation for understanding charismaphobia as a determinant of cosmetic use. While the behavioral foundation explains how charismaphobic cosmetic behavior is learned and maintained through reinforcement and avoidance, and the psychodynamic foundation explains the unconscious anxiety mechanisms that drive it, neither addresses the specific thought patterns, the identifiable, measurable, and therapeutically modifiable cognitive distortions that mediate between cultural beauty pressure and charismaphobic anxiety. The cognitive foundation fills this gap with clinical precision, providing both a theoretical explanation of why charismaphobic individuals experience beauty-related anxiety with such intensity and persistence, and a direct therapeutic rationale for charismatherapy's beauty perception education and attraction reframing phases. 3 cognitive theorists are particularly relevant. Aaron Beck, whose cognitive model of anxiety identifies the specific distortions that sustain it. Albert Ellis, whose rational emotive behavior therapy illuminates the irrational belief architecture of charismaphobia. And Carol Dweck, whose social cognitive mindset theory explains why charismaphobic individuals experience the threat of unattractiveness as a fundamental threat to their identity. Aaron Beck's cognitive model of emotional disorders, developed initially for depression and subsequently extended to anxiety, OCD, and a broad range of psychopathological conditions, proposes that emotional distress is not generated directly by external events, but by the cognitive appraisal of those events, the meanings, interpretations, and evaluations that the individual assigns to their experiences. At the core of Beck's model is the concept of cognitive distortions, systematic errors in thinking that consistently bias the individual's appraisal of themselves, others, and the world in ways that generate and sustain emotional distress. Cognitive distortions are not random errors, but patterned, predictable, and identifiable biases that reflect the individual's underlying core beliefs, deeply held, often unconscious convictions about the self and the world that organize the individual's entire perceptual and evaluative framework. Charismaphobia involves a specific and identifiable set of cognitive distortions that mediate between cultural beauty pressure and charismaphobic anxiety, and that sustain and escalate cosmetic behavior by systematically magnifying the perceived threat of unattractiveness. These distortions can be identified, named, and therapeutically targeted with clinical precision. Catastrophizing is the tendency to interpret perceived unattractiveness as a catastrophic social disaster rather than a manageable and contextually specific reality. The charismaphobic individual who notices a skin blemish, a sign of aging, or a deviation from cultural beauty standards does not appraise this observation proportionately. They catastrophize, concluding that this perceived flaw will result in total social rejection, complete loss of worth, and permanent ostracization. The mandatory diagnostic criterion of charismaphobia, i.e., having anxious thoughts about being regarded as unattractive by others, reflects precisely this catastrophizing appraisal pattern. The charismaphobic individual does not merely notice the possibility of being perceived as unattractive, but catastrophizes its consequences into a social catastrophe requiring urgent cosmetic intervention. Mind reading is the assumption that others are continuously, attentively, and negatively evaluating one's physical appearance. The charismaphobic individual assumes that their social environment is organized around the evaluation of their appearance, that others notice every perceived flaw, compare them unfavorably against beauty standards, and form negative judgments that determine their social value. This mind-reading distortion sustains the charismaphobic anxiety by making the social environment feel perpetually threatening and evaluative, generating the continuous self-monitoring and cosmetic management that characterize charismaphobic appearance behavior. All-or-nothing thinking is the binary evaluation of physical appearance as either completely attractive or completely unattractive, with no intermediate possibilities. The charismaphobic individual's self-evaluation of their appearance operates in categorical extremes. They are either meeting the cultural beauty standard or failing it entirely, either attractive or worthless, either cosmetically managed or socially unacceptable. This black-and-white thinking pattern makes the charismaphobic individual's self-worth extremely fragile. Any perceived deviation from the attractive pole of the binary immediately triggers the anxiety of total failure and drives cosmetic behavior aimed at restoring the attractive category. Selective abstraction is the tendency to focus exclusively on perceived physical inadequacies while ignoring or discounting genuine attractive qualities. The charismaphobic individual selectively abstracts the aspects of their appearance that fall short of cultural beauty standards, the skin irregularities, the signs of aging, the deviations from ideal body proportions, while systematically filtering out and discounting the physical features, personal qualities, and interpersonal capacities that constitute their genuine attractiveness. This selective abstraction sustains charismaphobic anxiety by maintaining a systematically distorted self-appraisal that is impervious to positive evidence. It is also the precise cognitive pattern that charismatherapy's unique feature identification phase therapeutically targets, directing the client's attention toward the genuine and distinctive physical features that selective abstraction has rendered invisible. Overgeneralization is drawing broad conclusions about one's permanent and universal unattractiveness from specific and contextually limited experiences. A single negative comment about appearance, a single social rejection, or a single unfavorable comparison with a media beauty ideal is overgeneralized into the conclusion that one is universally, permanently, and comprehensively unattractive. This overgeneralization pattern sustains and intensifies charismaphobic anxiety by transforming specific and manageable experiences into evidence of global and irremediable inadequacy. Personalization is the tendency to interpret social indifference, rejection, or negative outcomes as evidence of personal unattractiveness. The charismaphobic individual interprets a wide range of social experiences: a romantic rejection, a professional setback, a social gathering that does not go well, as evidence of their physical unattractiveness rather than as the product of contextual factors, interpersonal dynamics, or the other person's characteristics. This personalization pattern ensures that a wide range of negative social experiences continuously confirm and reinforce the charismaphobic core belief about unattractiveness. These cognitive distortions collectively sustain charismaphobic anxiety, not by accurately representing the individual's social reality, but by systematically distorting it in ways that maximize the perceived threat of unattractiveness. They constitute the cognitive architecture through which cultural beauty pressure is transformed into clinical charismaphobia. The mechanism by which the general social pressure to be attractive becomes, in vulnerable individuals, the intense, persistent, and clinically significant fear of unattractiveness that drives compulsive cosmetic behavior. The highly significant convergent validity of charismaphobia with OCD is particularly relevant here. OCD is the condition in which cognitive distortions most directly generate compulsive behavioral responses. And the parallel with charismaphobic cognitive distortions driving compulsive cosmetic behavior is clinically precise. Beck's concept of core beliefs adds a further cognitive dimension to the understanding of charismaphobia. Core beliefs are the deepest level of the cognitive architecture, the fundamental convictions about the self and the world from which cognitive distortions derive their content and organizing logic. The charismaphobic individual's cognitive distortions are generated by a specific and identifiable core belief that can be articulated as, "My worth as a person is determined by my physical attractiveness, and unless I am physically attractive, I am worthless and will be rejected." This core belief organizes the charismaphobic individual's entire perceptual and evaluative framework, making every social interaction a potential test of their attractiveness, every perceived physical flaw a confirmation of their worthlessness, and every cosmetic intervention a necessary defense against the catastrophic social rejection that the core belief predicts. Charismatherapy's beauty perception education and attraction reframing phases directly target this core belief, challenging its validity, exposing its cultural construction, and replacing it with the more accurate and therapeutically empowering belief that attraction is multidimensional, age-independent, culturally inclusive, and grounded in the whole person rather than in physical appearance alone. Albert Ellis's rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, developed contemporaneously with Beck's cognitive therapy, and sharing many of its core assumptions, offers a complementary cognitive foundation for understanding charismaphobia through the framework of irrational beliefs. Absolutistic, demanding, and self-defeating beliefs that generate neurotic distress by imposing unrealistic and inflexible standards on the self, others, and the world. Ellis proposed that irrational beliefs are characterized by three primary features: demandingness, the absolutistic insistence that things must or should be a certain way; awfulizing, the catastrophic evaluation of situations that fail to meet the demanded standard; and self-damnation, the global condemnation of the entire self on the basis of specific failures or inadequacies. The charismaphobic individual's relationship to physical attractiveness exhibits all three features of Ellisian irrational belief with particular clarity. The demanding component, "I must be physically attractive," transforms the natural human preference for social acceptance into an absolutistic and non-negotiable requirement. The awfulizing component, "It is absolutely terrible and catastrophic to be perceived as unattractive," magnifies the social consequences of unattractiveness far beyond their actual significance. The self-damnation component, "If I am unattractive, I am a worthless, unlovable, and fundamentally defective person," transforms specific physical characteristics into a comprehensive verdict on the individual's total worth as a human being. Together, these three components constitute the irrational belief architecture of charismaphobia, the cognitive structure that transforms cultural beauty pressure into the intense, persistent, and clinically significant fear of unattractiveness that defines the condition. Ellis's therapeutic technique of disputing irrational beliefs, systematically challenging the logical validity, empirical accuracy, and pragmatic utility of the charismaphobic individual's irrational beliefs, maps directly onto charismatherapy's beauty perception education and attraction reframing phases. The beauty perception education phase disputes the empirical accuracy of appearance-based irrational beliefs by demonstrating that beauty standards are culturally constructed, historically variable, and commercially manipulated, undermining the charismaphobic irrational belief that there is a fixed and objective standard of attractiveness that the individual must meet. The attraction reframing phase disputes the logical validity of the demanding component, demonstrating that attraction is not dependent on meeting cultural beauty standards, but is multidimensional, age-independent, and universally achievable. The holistic attraction development phase disputes the pragmatic utility of appearance-based self-worth, demonstrating that values, emotional expression, genuine warmth, and human aura generate more durable, more satisfying, and more genuinely attractive qualities than cosmetic enhancement ever can. Carol Dweck's social cognitive theory of implicit theories of intelligence provides a third cognitive dimension for understanding charismaphobia as a determinant of cosmetic use. Dweck proposed that individuals hold implicit theories about the nature of their personal qualities, including intelligence, personality, and social characteristics, that fundamentally shape their motivational responses to challenge, failure, and threat. Individuals with a fixed mindset believe that their qualities are fixed, immutable, and essentially determined, that they either have or do not have the relevant characteristic, and that effort, challenge, or failure reveal this fixed underlying quality rather than developing or changing it. Individuals with a growth mindset believe that their qualities are malleable, developable, and responsive to effort, learning, and experience, that challenges are opportunities for development rather than revelations of fixed inadequacy. Charismaphobic individuals exhibit a classically fixed mindset about physical attractiveness. They implicitly believe that their attractiveness is a fixed and immutable quality that they either possess or lack, and that cultural beauty standards reveal this fixed underlying quality with objective accuracy. This fixed mindset about attractiveness has several specific and clinically significant consequences. It makes any perceived deviation from cultural beauty standards feel catastrophic and irremediable. Because if attractiveness is fixed and cultural standards reveal it accurately, then falling short of those standards reveals a fixed and permanent inadequacy rather than a developable and improvable characteristic. It generates intense sensitivity to social evaluation of appearance, because every social interaction becomes a potential revelation of the fixed attractive or unattractive quality. Moreover, it drives cosmetic behavior as a strategy for artificially correcting or concealing the fixed inadequacy, because if attractiveness cannot be genuinely developed, it must be cosmetically manufactured. Charismatherapy's entire therapeutic architecture is a systematic cultivation of a growth mindset about attraction. The therapeutically transformative recognition that attraction is not a fixed quality revealed by cultural beauty standards, but a developable, multidimensional, and cultivable set of qualities that every person can genuinely grow. The unique feature identification phase cultivates a growth mindset about physical uniqueness, helping clients recognize that their distinctive physical features are genuine sources of attraction that can be appreciated and enhanced rather than fixed inadequacies to be cosmetically corrected. The holistic attraction development phase cultivates a growth mindset about the full range of attractive qualities, emotional expression, values, habits, and human aura, demonstrating that each of these dimensions is genuinely and substantially developable through intentional cultivation. The attraction reframing phase cultivates a growth mindset about attractiveness itself, replacing the charismaphobic fixed belief that attractiveness is determined by physical conformity to cultural beauty standards with the therapeutically liberating recognition that attraction is multidimensional, age-independent, and responsive to authentic self-development. Sociocultural foundations. The sociocultural school, drawing on social psychology, sociology, and cultural theory, offers a theoretical foundation for charismaphobia that operates at a different analytical level from the individual psychological perspectives provided by the behavioral, psychodynamic, humanistic, and cognitive foundations. While those foundations explain charismaphobia at the level of individual psychology, how the fear of unattractiveness is learned, maintained, dynamically structured, existentially experienced, and cognitively organized within the individual. The sociocultural foundation explains the social structures, cultural processes, and interactional mechanisms through which beauty standards are constructed, enforced, and internalized at the collective level. This structural dimension is indispensable for a complete theoretical account of charismaphobia because charismaphobia is, by definition, a condition generated by social recognition. The criterion and judgment for attractiveness in charismaphobia are obtained through social recognition, making the social and cultural processes through which that recognition is organized clinically essential to understand. 3 sociocultural theorists are particularly relevant. Irving Goffman, whose dramaturgical theory of social interaction illuminates the social performance architecture of charismaphobic cosmetic behavior. Henry Tajfel, whose social identity theory explains the identity-level threat that unattractiveness represents for charismaphobic individuals. And Leon Festinger, whose social comparison theory identifies the cognitive mechanism through which cultural beauty standards are internalized and sustained. Irving Goffman's dramaturgical theory of social interaction proposes that social life is structured as a theatrical performance in which individuals continuously manage the impressions they make on their social audience. In Goffman's framework, every social interaction is a performance staged by individuals' actors for the benefit of their social audience, using props, costumes, settings, and scripts to present a desired front. An idealized self-presentation designed to control the audience's perception and secure desired social responses. This dramaturgical framework is directly and profoundly applicable to charismaphobic cosmetic behavior, which can be understood as a specific and clinically significant form of Goffmanian impression management. The compulsive use of cosmetic props, costumes, and self-presentation strategies to perform attractiveness for a social audience whose approval the charismaphobic individual fears losing. The prevention zone of charismaphobic cosmetic behavior is a textbook case of Goffmanian impression management. The charismaphobic individual uses cosmetics not to resolve their fear of unattractiveness, but to perform attractiveness for their social audience, to maintain a cosmetically constructed front of beauty and social desirability that masks the underlying charismaphobic anxiety. Goffman's distinction between front stage behavior, the carefully managed performance presented to the social audience, and backstage behavior, the private, unmanaged, authentic self that the individual works to conceal from the audience, maps precisely onto the clinical phenomenology of charismaphobic pretense. The charismaphobic individual's front stage is the cosmetically constructed attractive presentation, while the backstage is the anxious, self-doubting, and fear-driven reality that the cosmetic performance is designed to conceal. Goffman's concept of stigma, the social discrediting and devaluation of individuals who fail to meet normative standards of appearance, behavior, or identity, is perhaps his most clinically relevant contribution to the understanding of charismaphobia. Goffman distinguished between discredited stigma, where the stigmatizing characteristic is already known to the social audience, and discreditable stigma, where the stigmatizing characteristic could be revealed but has not yet been. The charismaphobic individual's cosmetic behavior is precisely a stigma management strategy in Goffman's sense. Cosmetics are deployed to conceal the discreditable stigma of unattractiveness, to prevent the social audience from perceiving the physical characteristics that the charismaphobic individual believes would result in their social discrediting. The mandatory diagnostic criterion of taking medically unjustified measures to get or stay attractive is the behavioral expression of Goffmanian stigma management taken to its clinical extreme. The individual is willing to undergo medically unnecessary procedures in order to manage the discreditable stigma of perceived unattractiveness. Goffman further observed that the fear of stigmatization, the anxiety of potential social discrediting, is often more psychologically debilitating than actual stigmatization itself. The charismaphobic individual's chronic anxiety about being perceived as unattractive, even in the absence of any actual social rejection on the basis of appearance, reflects this Goffmanian insight. The anticipation of stigmatization is the primary driver of charismaphobic cosmetic behavior, not the actual experience of it. This also explains why cosmetic behavior fails to resolve charismaphobic anxiety. Because the stigma being managed is discreditable rather than discredited, the threat of its revelation can never be permanently eliminated, and the stigma management behavior must be continuously maintained and escalated. Charismatherapy addresses the Goffmanian dimension of charismaphobia directly through its foundational reframe, shifting clients from the compulsive front stage performance of cosmetically constructed attractiveness to the authentic backstage cultivation of genuine attraction. The author's aphorism, "Beauty is to feel beautiful," is a therapeutic invitation to move from Goffmanian impression management to Rogerian authentic self-expression. From the performance of attractiveness for a social audience to the genuine cultivation of multidimensional attraction that is independent of social evaluation. Henry Tajfel and John Turner's social identity theory proposes that human beings are fundamentally social creatures whose self-concept is significantly organized around their membership in social groups. Individuals derive self-esteem, identity, and psychological security from identifying with positively evaluated social groups, and sustain this positive social identity through social comparison processes that favorably distinguish their in-group from relevant out-groups. When individuals perceive their social group membership as threatened, devalued, or inadequate, when their group does not compare favorably with relevant out-groups, they experience identity threat and engage in various cognitive and behavioral strategies to restore positive social identity. Applied to charismaphobia, social identity theory illuminates the identity-level threat that the fear of unattractiveness represents. Charismaphobic individuals implicitly identify with the social group of physically attractive people, a group that is socially rewarded, positively evaluated, and afforded numerous social advantages. Attractive people, in almost all cultures, are taken positively, and the less attractive ones are ostracized. The charismaphobic individual's identity is organized around membership in the attractive social group, making the perceived threat of unattractiveness simultaneously a threat to their social group membership, and therefore to their social identity and self-esteem. Cosmetic use, in social identity theory terms, is an identity maintenance strategy, a behavioral means of sustaining membership in the positively evaluated social group of attractive people, and defending against the identity threat of being relegated to the negatively evaluated social group of unattractive people. This social identity theory perspective adds an important dimension to the understanding of charismaphobia that the individual psychological foundations cannot fully provide. It explains why the fear of unattractiveness is experienced not merely as an aesthetic concern, but as an identity threat. A threat to who the individual fundamentally is and to their place in the social world. The narcissistic trends dimension of charismaphobia i.e., the desire to be the most attractive person and to be regarded as a special person with unique attraction, reflects the social identity theory dynamic of in-group favoritism and positive distinctiveness. The charismaphobic individual does not merely want to be attractive, but wants to be distinctively and superiority attractive, maintaining the most favorable possible position in the social group hierarchy of physical attractiveness. Tajfel's concept of social categorization, the cognitive process through which individuals classify themselves and others into social categories, is also relevant to charismaphobia. The charismaphobic individual categorizes the social world into the attractive and the unattractive, a binary social categorization that reflects and reinforces the all-or-nothing thinking distortion identified in the cognitive foundation, and experiences the prospect of being categorized as unattractive as a fundamental social identity threat. Charismatherapy's attraction reframing phase directly challenges this binary social categorization by replacing it with the multidimensional, inclusive, and developable concept of holistic attraction, dissolving the attractive-unattractive binary, and replacing it with a continuous and universally accessible spectrum of genuine human attractiveness. Leon Festinger's social comparison theory, which proposes that individuals evaluate their own opinions, abilities, and characteristics by comparing themselves with others, provides the cognitive social mechanism through which cultural beauty standards are internalized and charismaphobic anxiety is continuously generated and sustained. In the absence of objective standards for evaluating personal characteristics, such as physical attractiveness, individuals rely on social comparison, comparing their own appearance with that of relevant others to determine whether they meet the cultural standard of attractiveness. This social comparison process is not neutral or self-correcting, but systematically biased toward upward comparison with individuals perceived as more attractive, which generates body dissatisfaction, appearance anxiety, and cosmetic use as strategies for closing the perceived attractiveness gap. Media plays a critical role in providing and amplifying the comparison targets that fuel charismaphobic social comparison. Media has a proven role in changing perceptions of beauty, promoting anti-aging products, and presenting females through unrealistically edited images, providing charismaphobic individuals with a continuous stream of idealized and cosmetically constructed comparison targets against which their own appearance inevitably falls short. The media consumption dimension of charismaphobia, the compulsive watching of beauty advertisements, subscribing to beauty channels, and searching for beauty products online, reflects the social comparison mechanism in its media-mediated form. The charismaphobic individual compulsively consumes beauty media because it provides the comparison targets that organize their self-evaluation, even though these comparisons consistently generate the upward comparison anxiety that sustains charismaphobic distress. Festinger also observed that social comparison processes generate pressure toward uniformity, the social pressure to conform to the standards and characteristics of the comparison group. In the context of charismaphobia, this pressure toward uniformity is experienced as the cultural pressure to conform to beauty standards, the social expectation that individuals should meet culturally specific standards of physical attractiveness. The social pressure of staying physically attractive may lead to several negative outcomes which can be placed under the single heading of charismaphobia. A clinical observation that directly reflects Festinger's pressure toward uniformity as a generator of appearance-related psychological distress. Charismatherapy addresses the social comparison mechanism of charismaphobia through the beauty perception education phase, which helps clients understand that the comparison targets provided by media are artificially constructed, commercially motivated, and deliberately designed to generate upward comparison anxiety. And through the attraction reframing phase, which replaces upward comparison with culturally imposed beauty standards with authentic self-evaluation against the multidimensional and individually specific standard of holistic attraction. By replacing the external, culturally imposed comparison standard with an internal, authentic, and individually calibrated standard of attraction, charismatherapy removes the social comparison mechanism from the charismaphobic individual's self-evaluative framework and replaces it with the genuine self-knowledge and authentic self-appreciation that constitute the foundation of holistic attraction. Humanistic foundations. The humanistic school of psychology, the third force in psychology, emerging as a response to the perceived determinism of psychoanalysis, and the perceived reductionism of behaviorism, offers a uniquely person-centered and growth-oriented theoretical foundation for understanding charismaphobia as a determinant of cosmetic use, and for articulating the therapeutic vision of charismatherapy. Three humanistic theorists are particularly relevant. Abraham Maslow, whose motivational theory provides a framework for understanding charismaphobic cosmetic behavior as fundamentally deficiency-driven. Carl Rogers, whose person-centered theory illuminates the role of conditions of worth in generating appearance-based anxiety. And Rollo May, whose existential humanistic framework distinguishes the normal anxiety of social pressure from the neurotic anxiety of charismaphobia. Together, these three theorists provide a humanistic foundation that is both theoretically rich and therapeutically generative, articulating not only why charismaphobic cosmetic behavior fails to satisfy, but what genuine psychological well-being and authentic attraction look like as therapeutic goals. Maslow distinguished between two fundamentally different categories of human motivation that have direct and profound clinical relevance to charismaphobia and cosmetic use. Deficiency motivation, also called demotivation, refers to behavior driven by the need to avoid or resolve a perceived deficiency, a state of lack or threat that the individual experiences as aversive and seeks to eliminate. Growth motivation, also called bemotivation or being motivation, refers to behavior driven by the desire to actualize one's potential, to become more fully oneself, to develop and express one's authentic capacities. These two motivational categories are not merely different in degree, but different in kind. They generate qualitatively different behavioral patterns, different experiential qualities, and different clinical trajectories. Charismaphobic cosmetic behavior is a textbook and clinically precise example of deficiency motivation. The charismaphobic individual's cosmetic use is not driven by a joyful aspiration toward beauty and self-expression. It is driven by the aversive experience of perceived unattractiveness and the fear of its social consequences. The charismaphobic individual uses cosmetics, seeks cosmetic procedures, and pursues cosmetic surgery not from a position of confident self-expression, but from a position of anxious self-deficit, attempting to eliminate the perceived deficiency of unattractiveness through cosmetic means. This deficiency motivational structure has a critical and clinically significant implication that Maslow articulated with particular clarity. Deficiency-motivated behavior can never be lastingly satisfied because the deficiency is experienced as perpetually threatening. Unlike growth-motivated behavior, which generates genuine satisfaction and psychological expansion as the individual actualizes their potential, deficiency-motivated behavior generates only temporary relief. Because the feared deficiency, once temporarily eliminated through cosmetic means, reasserts itself as the cosmetic effect fades, the aging process continues, or the cultural beauty standard shifts. This is the Maslowian mechanism of cosmetic dependency. The deficiency-motivated cosmetic behavior must be continuously repeated and escalated because the deficiency it addresses, the fear of unattractiveness, is never genuinely resolved, only temporarily masked. Maslow's hierarchy of needs offers a further dimension of psychodynamic depth to the understanding of charismaphobia. In Maslow's hierarchical framework, human needs are organized in a developmental sequence from basic physiological and safety needs through belonging and love needs to esteem needs and ultimately self-actualization. Esteem needs, the need for recognition, status, competence, and respect from others, occupy the fourth level of the hierarchy and constitute the motivational domain within which charismaphobia primarily operates. The charismaphobic individual's esteem needs have become pathologically organized around a single dimension: physical attractiveness, such that they can experience esteem, recognition, and social respect only through the medium of cosmetically managed appearance. This pathological narrowing of the esteem need onto physical attractiveness prevents the individual from ascending to the self-actualization level of the hierarchy, where genuine growth motivation, authentic self-development, and the full expression of human potential become possible. The self-exhibition dimension of charismaphobia, the compulsive desire to be socially appreciated for physical attractiveness and bodily features alone, is the behavioral manifestation of this pathologically narrowed esteem need. Charismatherapy's role, in Maslowian terms, is to reorganize and expand the client's esteem needs, helping them to discover and cultivate the authentic qualities, values, and interpersonal capacities through which genuine and lasting esteem can be earned and experienced. By expanding the foundation of the client's esteem needs beyond physical appearance, charismatherapy removes the motivational blockage that prevents self-actualization and opens the developmental pathway toward the growth motivation and authentic self-expression that Maslow identified as the hallmarks of psychological health. Carl Rogers' person-centered theory offers a humanistic framework for understanding charismaphobia that is both conceptually precise and therapeutically generative. Rogers proposed that psychological distress, including anxiety, compulsive behavior, and diminished self-worth, arises primarily from the internalization of conditions of worth, the learned standards that an individual believes they must meet to be worthy of love, acceptance, and positive regard from others. Conditions of worth are learned in early social development, from parents, peers, cultural institutions, and media, and become internalized as the criteria against which the individual measures their own worth. When conditions of worth are organized around characteristics that are difficult or impossible to achieve consistently, such as physical beauty as defined by culturally variable and commercially constructed standards, they generate chronic anxiety, compulsive self-monitoring, and distorted self-evaluation. Charismaphobic individuals have internalized physical attractiveness as a primary condition of worth. They have learned, through sustained exposure to cultural beauty standards, social reinforcement of attractiveness, and media promotion of cosmetically constructed beauty ideals, that they must be physically attractive in order to be worthy of social appreciation, love, and genuine recognition. The mandatory diagnostic criterion of charismaphobia, having a strong desire to be socially appreciated for physical attractiveness and bodily features alone, is the behavioral signature of this Rogerian condition of worth. The charismaphobic individual's sense of worth is contingently organized around physical attractiveness, making the fear of unattractiveness simultaneously the fear of worthlessness. The media consumption dimension of charismaphobia reflects the continuous external reinforcement of the appearance-based condition of worth through media exposure. The charismaphobic individual consumes beauty media compulsively because it continuously reaffirms and reinforces the standard against which they measure their worth. Rogers argued that the therapeutic antidote to conditions of worth is unconditional positive regard. The experience of being genuinely valued, accepted, and appreciated not contingently, on the basis of meeting specific standards, but unconditionally on the basis of one's authentic humanity. The therapeutic relationship in person-centered therapy provides this unconditional positive regard as a corrective emotional experience, demonstrating to the client that genuine appreciation and acceptance do not require the meeting of perfectionistic conditions of worth. Rogers' vision of the fully functioning person, characterized by openness to experience, existential living in the present moment, organismic trust in one's own perceptions and feelings, freedom of choice, and creativity, represents the humanistic ideal of psychological health toward which charismatherapy aspires. The fully functioning person, in Rogerian terms, is attractive not through cosmetic construction, but through authentic self-expression. Through the openness, warmth, genuine engagement, and creative vitality that Rogers identified as the hallmarks of psychological health, and that charismatherapy's holistic attraction development phase explicitly cultivates through emotional expression, values, habits, and human aura. The therapeutic architecture of charismatherapy is deeply Rogerian in its philosophical orientation. The beauty perception education phase dismantles appearance-based conditions of worth by exposing their cultural construction and commercial exploitation. The attraction reframing phase replaces the conditional standard of beauty, which generates chronic anxiety because it can never be permanently met with the unconditional capacity for attraction, which is available to every person regardless of their physical features. The unique feature identification phase provides the experience of genuine and unconditional appreciation for the client's authentic physical characteristics, not the cosmetically constructed characteristics that meet cultural beauty standards, but the distinctively personal characteristics that make the client genuinely and uniquely themselves. The holistic attraction development phase cultivates the values, emotional expressions, habits, and human aura that constitute the fully functioning person's authentic attractiveness, an attractiveness that is grounded in genuine self-expression rather than conditional worth performance. Rollo May's existential humanistic framework, particularly his distinction between normal anxiety and neurotic anxiety, provides a third humanistic dimension for understanding charismaphobia as a determinant of cosmetic use. May argued that anxiety is an inescapable feature of human existence, the inevitable accompaniment of freedom, possibility, and the awareness of one's own vulnerability in an uncertain world. Normal anxiety is a proportionate and appropriate response to genuine existential threat, the anxiety of facing genuine risks, making significant choices, or confronting real limitations. Normal anxiety is not a clinical problem, but a developmental resource, the motivational signal that meaningful challenges are being faced and that growth is being required. Neurotic anxiety, by contrast, is anxiety that has become disproportionate to its actual trigger. Anxiety that has been magnified, generalized, and chronically maintained beyond any relationship to genuine threat. Neurotic anxiety develops when the individual, unable to tolerate the normal anxiety of genuine existential challenge, retreats into defensive patterns that provide temporary relief at the cost of genuine growth and authentic living. The charismaphobic individual's anxiety about physical unattractiveness represents a textbook case of Mayan neurotic anxiety. The social consequences of unattractiveness, while real in culturally pressured environments, and while constituting a genuine source of normal anxiety, are experienced by the charismaphobic individual with a chronic intensity, pervasiveness, and behavioral urgency that far exceeds their actual social significance. The persistent and excessive nature of charismaphobic symptoms, which must be present for a minimum of 6 months to qualify as charismaphobia, and the mandatory criterion of taking medically unjustified measures to address the fear of unattractiveness, are the clinical signatures of neurotic anxiety in May's framework. Anxiety that has become self-perpetuating, disproportionate, and behaviorally compulsive. May further emphasized the role of freedom and responsibility in the generation and maintenance of neurotic anxiety. The individual's dim awareness that they could choose to define themselves differently, to value themselves on different grounds, to resist the cultural standards that generate their anxiety. But their experienced inability to exercise this freedom, which generates a secondary anxiety about the loss of authentic selfhood. The charismaphobic individual has the freedom to redefine beauty, to resist cosmetically constructed beauty standards, and to cultivate authentic attraction. But the cultural pressure of beauty standards, the commercial reinforcement of cosmetic solutions, and the social reward of cosmetically managed attractiveness make this freedom feel unavailable. Charismatherapy's beauty perception, education, and attraction reframing phases directly restore this existential freedom, helping clients to recognize that their definition of beauty, their standard of attractiveness, and their sources of self-worth are genuinely and practically their own choices rather than culturally imposed necessities. In Mayan terms, charismatherapy is an exercise in the restoration of existential freedom, the liberation of the client from the neurotic anxiety of culturally imposed beauty standards, and the cultivation of the authentic self-definition that May identified as the foundation of genuine psychological health. The convergence of Maslow, Rogers, and May in the humanistic foundation of charismatherapy is both theoretically coherent and clinically generative. All three theorists share the humanistic conviction that genuine psychological health cannot be achieved through external conformity, whether to beauty standards, conditions of worth, or culturally imposed definitions of worth, but only through authentic self-actualization, unconditional self-acceptance, and the courageous exercise of existential freedom. Charismatherapy's foundational aphorism, "Beauty is to feel beautiful," is the clinical distillation of this shared humanistic conviction. That beauty is not an external standard to be cosmetically achieved, but an internal experience to be authentically cultivated. The 5 phases of charismatherapy, discussed in detail in Chapter 4, operationalize this humanistic conviction into a structured, clinically applicable, and therapeutically powerful intervention that moves clients from the deficiency motivation of charismaphobic cosmetic dependency to the growth motivation of authentic, holistic, and cosmetically independent attraction. Positive psychology's foundations. Positive psychology, the scientific study of what enables individuals and communities to thrive, emerged as a distinct field through the foundational work of Martin Seligman and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi at the turn of the 21st century, explicitly positioning itself as a complement to clinical psychology's traditional focus on pathology, disorder, and deficit. While the behavioral, psychodynamic, humanistic, cognitive, and sociocultural foundations developed in the preceding sections explain charismaphobia primarily through the lens of what goes wrong. How fear-based avoidance, unconscious anxiety, deficiency motivation, cognitive distortion, and social pressure generate and maintain the fear of unattractiveness, the Positive Psychology Foundation offers a complementary and forward-looking perspective. A scientific account of what genuine psychological flourishing looks like and how it can be cultivated as the therapeutic goal of charismatherapy. 2 positive psychology theorists are particularly relevant. Martin Seligman, whose PERMA model of well-being provides a multi-dimensional framework for flourishing that maps directly onto charismatherapy's holistic attraction development phase. And Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, whose concept of flow, illuminates the qualitative difference between the anxious self-monitoring of charismaphobic cosmetic behavior and the authentic self-expression of genuine attraction. Martin Seligman's positive psychology framework proposes that genuine psychological flourishing comprises 5 distinct and measurable dimensions: positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. The PERMA model is not merely a descriptive taxonomy of well-being components, but a prescriptive and therapeutically generative framework, identifying the specific dimensions of human experience that must be cultivated for genuine and lasting psychological flourishing, as distinct from the temporary and ultimately unsatisfying relief provided by the avoidance of negative states. The relevance of the PERMA model to charismaphobia and charismatherapy is both direct and clinically precise. Charismaphobic cosmetic behavior fails to generate genuine psychological flourishing, not merely because it is fear-based and avoidance-motivated, as the behavioral and psychodynamic foundations establish, but because it systematically fails to cultivate any of the 5 PERMA dimensions of genuine well-being. Cosmetic procedures generate neither authentic positive emotions nor genuine engagement with life. They generate temporary anxiety relief, which is an entirely different and clinically inferior experiential quality. They do not deepen relationships. The charismaphobic individual's compulsive focus on physical appearance management actually impairs relationship quality by substituting cosmetic performance for authentic interpersonal engagement. They do not provide genuine meaning. Physical attractiveness is a cosmetically manufactured characteristic rather than a meaningful personal accomplishment or values expression. Furthermore, the temporary cosmetic accomplishment of enhanced appearance does not constitute the genuine accomplishment that Seligman's framework identifies as a component of flourishing, because it is externally imposed, cosmetically dependent, and continuously threatened by aging, cultural change, and the fading of cosmetic effects. Charismatherapy's holistic attraction development phase, by contrast, directly and comprehensively cultivates all 5 PERMA dimensions simultaneously. This correspondence is clinically significant and can be articulated with precision. Positive emotions. Charismatherapy cultivates genuine positive emotions through the development of humor, warmth, and emotional expressiveness as components of holistic attraction. The charismaphobic individual who learns to express genuine warmth, to find and share humor, and to engage authentically with others generates authentic positive emotions, both in themselves and in those they interact with, that are qualitatively richer, more durable, and more genuinely attractive than the anxious relief of successful cosmetic performance. Engagement. Charismatherapy cultivates genuine engagement through the unique feature identification phase, helping clients to fully engage with and appreciate their authentic physical characteristics rather than monitoring them anxiously for inadequacy, and through the development of personal style as authentic self-expression rather than cosmetic masking. The engaged, present, and authentic individual is genuinely attractive in ways that the anxiously self-monitoring cosmetic performer cannot be. Relationships. Charismatherapy directly cultivates relationship quality through the values component of holistic attraction: love, care, mercy, frankness, and appraisal, each of which is simultaneously a relational quality and a source of genuine interpersonal attraction. The charismaphobic individual who develops genuine care, authentic frankness, and warm appraisal of others generates the kind of relational attraction that Seligman's framework identifies as a core component of flourishing, and that cosmetic enhancement cannot manufacture. Meaning. Charismatherapy cultivates meaning through the values component of holistic attraction and through the foundational reframe of beauty as an internal experience rather than an external conformity. The charismaphobic individual who discovers that their genuine attractiveness is grounded in their authentic values, emotional expressions, and human aura discovers a source of personal meaning that is both more durable and more deeply satisfying than the cosmetically manufactured attractiveness they have been pursuing. Accomplishment. Charismatherapy cultivates genuine accomplishment through the progressive development of holistic attraction capacities. the cultivation of emotional expressiveness, the development of values-based interpersonal qualities, the enhancement of unique physical features through authentic presentation strategies. These are genuine developmental accomplishments, qualities that the individual genuinely grows through effort, self-awareness, and authentic engagement, rather than cosmetically manufactured appearances that are purchased rather than earned. Seligman's earlier concept of learned helplessness, the state of passive resignation that develops when individuals repeatedly experience outcomes as beyond their control, also adds a relevant dimension to the understanding of charismaphobic cosmetic dependency. The charismaphobic individual who has repeatedly sought cosmetic interventions without achieving lasting relief from the fear of unattractiveness may develop a form of appearance-related learned helplessness, a passive resignation to the chronic anxiety of charismaphobia, punctuated by compulsive but ultimately futile cosmetic interventions. Charismatherapy's active cultivation of controllable and genuinely developable attraction qualities, emotional expression, values, habits, and human aura, directly counters this learned helplessness by demonstrating that genuine and lasting attraction is not beyond the individual's control, but is entirely within their capacity to cultivate authentically. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, the state of optimal psychological experience characterized by complete absorption in a challenging and meaningful activity, loss of self-consciousness, intrinsic motivation, and the experience of effortless, skilled engagement, offers a positive psychology framework for understanding the qualitative difference between the psychological experience of charismaphobic cosmetic behavior and the psychological experience of authentic holistic attraction as cultivated by charismatherapy. Flow states are characterized by several specific features that distinguish them from the ordinary and the anxious. Complete absorption in the activity at hand, such that self-consciousness and self-monitoring recede. A sense of effortless control and skilled mastery. Intrinsic motivation. The activity is pursued for its own inherent satisfaction rather than for external reward or the avoidance of punishment, and a positive hedonic quality. The experience of genuine enjoyment, vitality, and aliveness that Csikszentmihalyi distinguished from the mere absence of distress. Flow states represent the positive psychology counterpart to the humanistic concept of self-actualization. Both describe the experiential quality of the human being functioning at its authentic best. Charismaphobic cosmetic behavior is the precise psychological antithesis of flow. Rather than complete absorption and loss of self-consciousness, charismaphobic cosmetic behavior is characterized by hypervigilant self-monitoring. The compulsive, anxious observation and evaluation of one's own appearance from the imagined perspective of a critical social audience. Rather than intrinsic motivation, charismaphobic cosmetic behavior is driven by extrinsic avoidance motivation. The fear of the social consequences of unattractiveness rather than any intrinsic satisfaction in the cosmetic activity itself. Rather than effortless skilled mastery, charismaphobic cosmetic behavior generates chronic anxiety, dependency, and escalation, the opposite of mastery. Rather than genuine, positive hedonic experience, charismaphobic cosmetic behavior generates only temporary anxiety relief, a qualitatively impoverished experiential state that Csikszentmihalyi's framework would recognize as the opposite of flourishing. Authentic holistic attraction, as cultivated through charismatherapy, is, by contrast, genuinely compatible with flow states. The individual who has developed genuine emotional expressiveness, authentic values-based interpersonal engagement, and confident appreciation of their unique physical features can engage in social interactions with the absorption, intrinsic motivation, and effortless authenticity that characterize flow. Genuine attraction is not performed for a social audience. It is expressed from authentic engagement with the social world, and this expression has the intrinsic quality of flow rather than the extrinsic anxiety of impression management. Charismatherapy's foundational aphorism, "Beauty is to feel beautiful," captures this Csikszentmihalyian insight. Genuine beauty is not a performance evaluated by external audiences, but an internal experience of authentic engagement, confident self-expression, and the effortless vitality of living fully in one's own skin. The positive psychology foundation thus provides charismatherapy with both its scientific framework for genuine flourishing as the therapeutic goal, through Seligman's PERMA model, and its phenomenological characterization of what authentic attraction feels like as a lived experience, through Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow. Together, these two positive psychology perspectives complete the theoretical architecture of the book by supplying what the pathology-focused foundations cannot: a scientifically grounded, empirically supported, and experientially rich account of what genuine psychological health, authentic attraction, and holistic flourishing look like as the destination toward which charismatherapy guides its clients. Feminist foundations. Feminist theory, drawing on philosophy, sociology, political science, and cultural studies, offers a theoretical foundation for charismaphobia that operates at a level of analysis distinct from all the preceding foundations. While the behavioral, psychodynamic, humanistic, cognitive, sociocultural, and positive psychology foundations explain charismaphobia primarily as a psychological phenomenon, a condition of individual anxiety, cognitive distortion, unconscious conflict, or motivational deficit, the feminist foundation reveals charismaphobia as simultaneously a political phenomenon, a condition generated, sustained, and commercially exploited by structural systems of gender-based power that use beauty standards as instruments of social control. This political dimension is indispensable for a complete theoretical account of charismaphobia because it explains not merely how the fear of unattractiveness operates within the individual, but why cultural beauty standards are constructed with the specific content, intensity, and pervasiveness that they have, and whose interests are served by their enforcement. Three feminist theorists are particularly relevant: Naomi Wolf, whose concept of the beauty myth illuminates the political function of beauty standards in the subordination of women; Sandra Bartke, whose Foucauldian feminist analysis of disciplinary practices of femininity explains the self-surveillance mechanisms of charismaphobic appearance management; and Susan Bordeaux, whose cultural feminist analysis of the body as a site of social inscription illuminates the bodily dimensions of charismaphobic cosmetic use. An important qualification runs throughout this section: charismaphobia affects both men and women, meaning that the feminist foundation, while providing essential insights into the cultural origins and political functions of beauty standard-driven anxiety, must be applied with gender-inclusive sensitivity rather than as an exclusively female-centered analysis. Naomi Wolf's work proposed that the cultural obsession with female physical beauty is not a natural, inevitable, or benign feature of human social life, but a politically constructed myth, a system of ideological control that expands to fill whatever space women gain in public, professional, and political life. Wolf argued that as women have achieved greater social, economic, and political equality over the course of the 20th century, the beauty standard has intensified proportionately, demanding more time, money, physical risk, and psychological energy from women in the management of their appearance. The beauty myth, in Wolf's analysis, functions as a counteroffensive against women's liberation, a cultural mechanism that redirects women's energy, resources, and self-evaluation from their genuine capacities and achievements toward the endless, commercially driven, and ultimately unachievable pursuit of physical beauty. The beauty myth framework is directly and powerfully applicable to charismaphobia. Charismaphobia, the fear of unattractiveness, is the psychological internalization of the beauty myth, the process by which the externally imposed cultural standard of beauty becomes an internally experienced and clinically significant anxiety about failing to meet it. The social pressure of staying physically attractive may lead to several negative outcomes which can be placed under the single heading of charismaphobia. And Wolf's framework explains why this social pressure exists, who generates it, and whose interests it serves. The beauty and cosmetic industry, which commercially benefits from the fear of unattractiveness, is structurally invested in the maintenance and intensification of beauty standards that generate charismaphobic anxiety. Because charismaphobic anxiety is the primary psychological mechanism that drives cosmetic consumption. Media promotes cosmetic surgeries. Celebrity idealization is one of the strongest reasons for undergoing cosmetic surgery, and the beauty industry builds rapport between cosmetic producers and consumers, all of which are the commercial operationalization of Wolf's beauty myth in the contemporary media landscape. Wolf's analysis further illuminates why beauty standards are structurally designed to be unachievable, why the cosmetic interventions that promise to resolve the fear of unattractiveness consistently fail to do so. If beauty standards were achievable, the commercial engine of the beauty industry would stall. Consumers who successfully achieved the beauty standard would no longer need to purchase beauty products, seek cosmetic procedures, or consume beauty media. The unachievability of the beauty standard is therefore not an incidental feature, but a structural necessity of the commercial system that generates and enforces it. This structural unachievability is the political-economic explanation for the clinical phenomenon that charismatherapy addresses: the compulsive repetition and escalation of cosmetic behavior that never achieves lasting resolution of charismaphobic anxiety. The beauty myth is designed to be perpetually threatening precisely because a perpetually threatened consumer is a perpetually consuming one. Charismatherapy's beauty perception education phase is a direct therapeutic response to Wolf's beauty myth, providing clients with the critical understanding that the beauty standards generating their charismaphobic anxiety are not natural, objective, or inevitable, but politically constructed, commercially motivated, and deliberately designed to be unachievable. This psychoeducational dismantling of the beauty myth removes the ideological foundation of the charismaphobic core belief, the belief that there is a fixed and objective beauty standard that the individual must meet, and replaces it with the critical awareness that beauty standards are instruments of commercial and political power rather than genuine measures of human worth or attractiveness. Sandra Bartke's feminist analysis of the body examines how cultural beauty standards are enforced not through external coercion, but through the internalization of self-surveillance, the process by which women learn to monitor, evaluate, and discipline their own bodies according to the standards of an internalized male gaze. Bartke argued that the practices of femininity, dieting, makeup application, hairstyling, skin care, and cosmetic use constitute a system of disciplinary practices that women perform on their own bodies as a form of self-discipline that reproduces patriarchal power relations from within rather than imposing them from without. Bartke's concept of the internalized male gaze, the adopted perspective of an imagined critical male observer that women apply to their own bodies in continuous self-surveillance, is directly applicable to the charismaphobic experience. The charismaphobic individual's compulsive self-monitoring of physical appearance, the anxious, critical observation of one's own body from the imagined perspective of a socially evaluative audience, is the clinical manifestation of Bartke's internalized disciplinary gaze. The mandatory diagnostic criterion of having anxious thoughts about being regarded as unattractive by others is the subjective experience of Bartke's internalized gaze. The charismaphobic individual has so thoroughly internalized the evaluative perspective of the imagined social audience that their own self-perception is organized around that imagined evaluation rather than around authentic self-knowledge. Bartke further observed that the disciplinary practices of femininity are characterized by a fundamental asymmetry of effort and reward. Women invest enormous amounts of time, money, physical discomfort, and psychological energy in beauty practices, but the social rewards for this investment are conditional, temporary, and always contingent on meeting a standard that continuously shifts. This asymmetry of effort and reward is the structural explanation for the clinical phenomenon of charismaphobic cosmetic dependency. The individual invests continuously and escalatingly in cosmetic behaviors, but never achieves the lasting social reward that the investment promises, because the beauty standard that determines the reward is structurally designed to remain just beyond the reach of any given level of cosmetic investment. The cosmetic dermatologists in the earlier study confirmed that the psychological problems of their clients contributed to making those clients dependent on dermatological treatments and increased the number of visits. A clinical finding that directly reflects Bartke's disciplinary asymmetry of effort and reward operating in the contemporary cosmetic medicine context. Bartke's analysis also illuminates an important dimension of charismaphobia that the individual psychological foundations cannot fully account for: the shame that accompanies charismaphobic anxiety. Bartke argued that the failure to meet the standards of the disciplinary practices of femininity generates not merely disappointment or concern, but shame, a pervasive and embodied sense of personal inadequacy and social unworthiness. The charismaphobic individual's anxious thoughts about being regarded as unattractive carry the specific affective quality of shame. The fear of social exposure as inadequate, unworthy, and failing to meet the standards that cultural femininity demands. This shame dimension of charismaphobia connects to the psychodynamic foundation, Horny's basic anxiety and Freud's ego ideal, and to the cognitive foundation, Beck's core belief of worthlessness, demonstrating the theoretical complementarity of the feminist and psychological foundations in providing a complete account of the charismaphobic experience. Charismatherapy's unique feature identification phase, which reverses the charismaphobic focus on inadequacy by identifying and celebrating each client's distinctive physical attributes, constitutes a direct therapeutic response to Bartke's disciplinary self-surveillance. By redirecting the client's self-observational gaze from the internalized disciplinary perspective of external evaluation to an authentic and appreciative perspective on their own genuine physical uniqueness, charismatherapy replaces Bartke's disciplinary gaze with what Rogers would call unconditional positive self-regard, a fundamentally different and therapeutically transformative relationship with one's own body and appearance. Susan Bordeaux extended Bartke's Foucauldian feminist analysis to examine the body as a site of cultural inscription, a surface on which the values, anxieties, and power relations of the dominant culture are written and enforced through the disciplinary practices of appearance management, dieting, cosmetic surgery, and bodily modification. Bordeaux argued that the contemporary cultural obsession with the managed, controlled, and cosmetically perfected body reflects a broader cultural anxiety about the unruly, aging, and imperfect body. An anxiety that is projected onto individuals, particularly women, in the form of the imperative to manage, discipline, and cosmetically correct the body's natural characteristics. Bordeaux's concept of the body as a site of cultural inscription is directly applicable to charismaphobia. The charismaphobic individual's body has become the primary surface on which the cultural anxiety about unattractiveness is inscribed and managed, the site onto which the broader cultural fear of social rejection, aging, and nonconformity is displaced and addressed through cosmetic intervention. Taking medically unjustified measures to get or stay attractive, the mandatory behavioral criterion of charismaphobia, is the clinical expression of Bordeaux's cultural inscription of beauty imperatives onto the individual body. The individual submits their body to medically unnecessary procedures because the cultural inscription of beauty standards has generated a fear of the unmanaged, uncosmetically corrected body that is powerful enough to override medical judgment and financial prudence. Bordeaux's analysis of cosmetic surgery as cultural normalization, the process by which surgical modification of the body comes to be experienced not as an extreme intervention, but as a routine and expected response to the cultural standard of beauty, is particularly relevant to the treatment mode of charismaphobic cosmetic behavior. As charismaphobic anxiety escalates and individuals migrate from prevention zone cosmetic behaviors toward treatment zone cosmetic interventions, surgical procedures that were initially experienced as extreme become normalized and routine, reflecting precisely the cultural normalization process that Bordeaux identified. Media promotes cosmetic surgeries, and the cosmetic dermatologists in an earlier study were found recommending extreme medical procedures at a rate of 53.33%. A clinical finding that reflects the normalization of cosmetic surgery as a routine response to beauty standard anxiety that Bordeaux's framework predicted. Bordeaux also examined the specifically temporal dimension of beauty-related cultural anxiety. The cultural inscription of aging as a bodily failure requiring cosmetic correction. The cultural imperative to resist aging, to maintain the appearance of youth through anti-aging products, procedures, and surgeries, inscribes the naturally aging body as defective, inadequate, and socially unacceptable. This temporal inscription of aging as beauty failure is directly reflected in the anxiety subscale of charismaphobia, which includes items reflecting worry about declining physical attractiveness with age, fear of losing social value with aging, and fear of not receiving appreciation for physical attractiveness in the future. Charismatherapy's attraction reframing phase, which establishes that attraction is age-independent, culturally inclusive, and grounded in multidimensional authentic qualities rather than cosmetically managed physical conformity, constitutes a direct therapeutic counter-inscription to Bordeaux's cultural inscription of beauty imperatives onto the aging body. By replacing the culturally inscribed equation of beauty with youth with the therapeutically liberating recognition that genuine attraction transcends age, charismatherapy removes the temporal dimension of charismaphobic anxiety, the fear of becoming unattractive, and replaces it with the authentic understanding that different ages carry their own distinctive and genuine forms of attraction. A critical qualification must be explicitly addressed in the feminist foundation of charismaphobia. The feminist theorists reviewed in this section developed their analyses primarily with reference to women's experience of beauty standards and cosmetic use. This gender specificity reflects the historical reality that cultural beauty standards have operated with greater intensity, pervasiveness, and social consequence for women than for men. Women face more cultural impositions and are called the bearers of culture, and societies objectify women sexually, evaluate them for attraction more than men, put more pressure on them to stay beautiful, and promote professional success for women who are more beautiful. However, charismaphobia is explicitly a gender-inclusive condition. It can be present in both men and women. The feminist analysis of beauty standards as instruments of political power, commercial exploitation, and self-surveillance is fully applicable to charismaphobia in both men and women. The structural systems that generate and enforce beauty standards affect men as well as women, even if the specific content, intensity, and social consequences of those standards differ by gender. Men experience beauty standard pressure through the cultural imperatives of physical strength, muscular bodies, and higher socioeconomic status. A gendered beauty standard that, while differently constructed from female beauty standards, operates through the same commercial, media-driven, and self-surveillance mechanisms that Wolfe, Bartkey, and Bordeaux identified in the female context. The feminist foundation of charismatherapy, therefore, applies not as a gender-specific analysis, but as a structural critique of beauty standards as instruments of power. Recognizing that these standards affect both men and women, that their specific content is gendered in culturally specific ways, and that their commercial exploitation and political function operate across genders even as their phenomenological expression differs. Charismatherapy's beauty perception education phase addresses this structural dimension for all clients regardless of gender, providing the critical awareness that the beauty standards generating their charismaphobic anxiety are commercially constructed, politically functional, and deliberately designed to sustain the fear of unattractiveness that drives cosmetic consumption. Chapter Summary. The 7 theoretical foundations developed in this chapter: psychodynamic, behavioral, cognitive, sociocultural, humanistic, positive psychological, and feminist, collectively establish charismaphobia as a psychological condition of remarkable theoretical depth and explanatory breadth. No single theoretical framework is sufficient to account for the full range of charismaphobia's clinical manifestations. It takes the psychodynamic tradition to explain how cosmetic dependency functions as a neurotic symptom maintained by temporary anxiety reduction rather than by genuine resolution. The behavioral tradition to explain how negative reinforcement sustains and escalates the compulsive cosmetic behavior cycle. The cognitive tradition to identify the specific distortions, through which cultural beauty pressure is transformed into clinically significant personal anxiety. The sociocultural tradition to explain how beauty standards are constructed, enforced, and internalized at the collective level. The humanistic tradition to articulate the deficiency motivation and conditions of worth that make charismaphobic cosmetic dependency psychologically self-defeating. The positive psychological tradition to specify what genuine flourishing looks like as the therapeutic destination. And the feminist tradition to reveal the political and commercial architecture through which beauty standards are generated and sustained as instruments of power and profit. Together, these frameworks do not merely explain charismaphobia. They map the specific theoretical targets that a comprehensive therapeutic response must address. The insufficiency of existing theoretical frameworks, terror management theory, objectification theory, social comparison theory, and evolutionary psychology, each of which captures important dimensions of cosmetic behavior while failing to provide the clinical comprehensiveness, diagnostic framework, and therapeutic architecture that charismaphobia theory provides, further establishes the distinctive and necessary contribution of the charismaphobia construct. Chapter 3 translates this multi-theoretical foundation into the formal clinical definition, symptom structure, factor architecture, and psychometric validation of charismaphobia as a measurable and empirically grounded psychological construct.